Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on journal entry batches, corrections, copying, and recurring entry. Today we have Chuck Hayes, the Director of Application Services here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over all the questions at the end. Thank you, and I'll now hand it over to Chuck.
Thank you, Colleen. And Colleen, would you just confirm that you're seeing my slides in the Zoom meeting?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. So it wasn't showing quite the same way on my side like it should, so I thought I'd ask.
Okay.
Well, welcome everybody to our Zobrio University session on these interesting issues that you may face related to journal entry batches. Let's talk about the topics that we want to cover today in our session. We want to look at the copy features available with batches as a whole or in part for information that's inside the batch. And that also kind of relates to the last piece about using recurring batches. We also want to look at how to do corrections to batches because, you know, if you make it like a date mistake, you don't have to go into every row and fix it. And then what about the reversal options that may be needed? There are types of reversals that may be at issue. And then finally, we want to take a look at how to create and use recurring batches. And there's an interesting feature in Financial Edge that makes it really, really simple, especially when you have a situation where the dollar amounts might change a lot. So I'll make sure we talk about all of those. So let's take them one at a time, and I'll dive into the database, a little sample database here, and show you what we're talking about. So first of all, let's take a look at this issue of copying batches or rows, or actually there's some other features as well for copying cells. So I have a sample batch that I'm going to work with. And let me just kind of make a window size for this conversation just so we can kind of see everything that's going on around us. So this is just a basic batch, and at the moment it happens to balance. So let's go through several different what-if circumstances. So let's suppose that in this example, it's intended to represent like a payroll batch, but it's got some other expenses that we use in the sample database. So we'll pretend it's something that we do on a regular basis. But let's pretend it is something like payroll. And pretty much, you know, it's a regular payroll, every pay period, maybe a few dollar amounts change. So what if I want to just, you know, copy the batch I used last pay period? So regardless of whether the batch has been posted or not, you can copy any batch to another new batch. And that's referred to in the button at the top, copy batch as regular. So a regular batch, but just give me a new one. So if we just pay attention to what I've got here, this is batch number 833. So if I want to create a new batch from this batch, I simply click the button, copy batch as regular. Now, let's pay attention to what actually happens. So first of all, my original batch is unaffected. My new batch has not yet been saved, so it has not yet been numbered by the system, but everything that you saw automatically copied. And there were two changes to the batch header. So the batch header now says that it's a copied batch. Now, of course, I can change that to whatever, you know, I'd like to do. I'll change that in a moment. And then I can also have this batch note that maybe I don't really need that, so I can delete the header note. Let me go ahead and save without closing, and you'll see that now this is definitely a distinct additional batch. At this moment in time, they happen to be identical. So I'm going to close my original batch and just work with this copy that I created. So that's the first thing. I can copy any batch, and like I said, it can be posted, that's fine. It'll copy to a regular unposted batch as if you're starting over again, but with the same information. So let's say I've copied this and I want to take, let's pretend that I need to add another, so I'm using projects in this database. Not everybody uses projects, but you see I've got project 2302. So let's say that I need to add entries for project 2301 with some of these very similar counts, and I really don't want to have to redo all of this data entry. So this is where you can copy one or more rows, and you can take advantage of Windows features for the Shift key and the Control key when you're copying. So let's just do a very simple example. So I can just copy one row by highlighting, and I always recommend make sure you click the square on the far left where the number for the row is located to select the entire row. So I can copy one row, and you'll see that I can right-click, and I've got an option called Copy Selected Transactions. Well, I can also copy more than one row. So like all Windows software, if you select a row, hold down the Shift key, and then select another row further in the list, like this one, then I can select a range. So I can go ahead and select the entire range, and then I can right-click, Copy Selected Transactions, go to the end, highlight the row where I want to copy them, and go ahead and right-click and paste selected transactions. And all of those rows that I just highlighted will be copied. What if I want to copy non-continuous rows? Again, you can use the Windows feature for non-continuous selections of any situation by using the Control key and clicking on. So for example, I want row 1, okay? Now I hold down the Control key. Now I want row 3. Keep holding down the Control key. I want number 5. So I'm doing non-continuous copies of non-continuous rows. Right-click, Copy Selected Transactions. And I'll go down to the bottom, and I will paste them. And so now I get what was 5,000, 50, 30, and 5110. So I can copy combinations of rows at any time. By the way, this is a side note, but I think it's important. You may have noticed when I did the right-click action, we also have these options to export the list to Excel. You can also insert and delete rows as well. So that's if I want to copy rows. There's another feature for copying that is more at the cell level. So let's pretend that for this new grant, and I'll get into the global change vision, that's our next topic, but you know, if I had something here where I wanted to change this description to be something other than grant activity, but if I just change this to these salaries. Oh, it's called payroll. I like that. Payroll info. Now I can go to the next cell, and when I right-click inside any cell, you'll notice there's a choice to copy above cell. So now I can just copy that text from the previous one. That's helpful sometimes when you're not intending to change everything, or you're doing new data entry, you just want to copy that description over again, but you don't want to use the Windows clipboard. So you can always copy cell information from directly above. Okay, so I can copy the entire batch. I also can copy rows within a batch, and I can copy cell information. And when I'm copying rows, I can do continuous rows, one row, or non-continuous rows. Going back to the copy the entire batch option, you'll notice there's a choice called copy batch as recurring. So I'm going to talk about that, but in the context of our third bullet point in my original slide list. Okay, so let's talk corrections and reversals within the batch. So we'll take this example of this particular batch where I already have some existing information. And, you know, I'm looking at this batch and saying, you know what, I really need to have all of these journal reference fields, say, copy, you know, say grant activity payroll information. So I'm just going to copy that to clipboard for a moment. Well, I don't have to go into each individual row. And what I'm about to show you applies to other fields as well, and I can actually change more than one field at the same time. So this will introduce you to the global change feature that is an option in administration, but you don't have to go to administration. In fact, you can't, this method I'm going to show you works from within the batch while it's open. So while I have a batch open, I go to the batch menu, and little tip, if you're not sure what to do, but you know there's something you can do, and you're not sure where the option is from the menus, just go to the menu that matches the record type. So I'm in the batch menu, or batch record, so I go to batch menu. You'll see there's a choice that says globally change transactions. What this means is each row in a journal entry batch is a transaction record. That's the actual name of that row. It's actually a record behind it. And you're doing changes within this batch. So globally change transactions. I'll let it go ahead and save the file. this is going to temporarily bring up a global change file. Now, this is a separate feature in Financial Edge. I won't be saving this file because you notice there was no option to pick from an existing global change file. So think of this as something that you do on the fly whenever you need it, and you just start over again for whatever the current change is. So I'm going to go ahead and say, well, what is it that I want to change? Well, I was referring to the journal reference field. So let's bring that over. Just double click or use the select button at the bottom. And my choices are very interesting for what is basically a text field. And we're going to focus on the first one. So if I want to change the entire text of the field, then I would typically use either add or replace. Now they can kind of end up at the same place. If I choose replace, I just have to be aware that, wait a minute, if the text that I'm replacing exists differently in different fields, I might create an unintended consequence. So if I'm changing the entire field, what I'll probably do is do add, because I've got a checkbox at the bottom, overwrite existing value. So I'll just say, let's go ahead and add grant activity payroll info to every journal reference field, and I don't care what's already in there, just change all of them, okay? Now I can do the same thing at the same time with the post date. So I copied this batch, and let's pretend that, well, actually, you know, I realize that was from August, but I want to use the September date. So I can bring over the post date field. Same situation. I realize there's only one date in this, and I could use the replace feature, but if I got more than one date and they all need to be the same, I'll just pick the new date. So I'll just go ahead and say, you know what, this was last Friday's payroll, and I'll overwrite the existing value. So I want to basically replace with the add feature. I'm going to change the journal reference to all be the same, and I'm going to change the post date to all be the same. Now you can preview the changes. In this example, it doesn't really, you know, 6 1 half does the other. I know what I'm changing in the background, so I'll go ahead and click change now. And what you're looking for is if there are circumstances like the partially changed for the 2 because I had already changed part of that text. So. And I did check the box to create a control report. Usually you can turn that off because the dialog will show you if there are exceptions. So now once I've gone ahead and I'll close the file, saving it doesn't do anything because you can't select it in the future. So now when I go back, so there's my journal reference field has been changed, and now all of my dates have been changed to September 20th. So global change is built in to the existing file. Just open the journal entry batch, invoke the global change from the batch menu, change whatever features or fields you want, and voila, once you finish the process. Now, what about reversals? So there are a couple different scenarios related to reversals. There's the idea of, what if I want to reverse the entire batch, which is primarily what I wanted to talk about. But then there is a reverse on feature you may have noticed as a reverse on date inside the batch, and that begs the question, well, what's that all about? So let's start with the issue of reversing the entire batch. So I'm just going to close this sample batch that I've been working with and go back to the one that was originally dated for sample August activity. So first of all, in order to reverse the batch needs to be posted. So I'm going to go ahead, I believe everything balances on this batch. So let's go ahead and post this batch. That's that little green exclamation point. Okay, so that was successful, which is what I was expecting. All right, so now I have a posted batch, the one that was the basis for my previous copy. So you may notice that up at the top of the batch, that green exclamation point still exists, but it's grayed out because the batch has already been posted. And now I have a new option. It's the green exclamation point, but with a backward-facing blue arrow, meaning to reverse the batch. And you'll see in the batch menu, create reversing batch. So what this option will do, which I'll click in just a moment, but I'd like to mention what it's going to do, excuse me, it will go ahead, take this batch exactly the way it is, and all the debits will become credits and the credits will become debits. So let's go ahead and create the reversing batch. Now again, just to be clear, my original batch is unaffected. And let me just go to the next one. There we go. But now I've got everything reversed row for row, just like it was originally. The system also is going to insert, if you use the default settings and configuration, which most databases do, it's going to insert the phrase reversal in the journal entry text field before the existing text that was already there. Sometimes I'll get the question, okay, I understand how to reverse the entire batch, but what if I only need to use certain rows from the batch? Okay, well then just delete the rows you don't want. So it's an accounting decision if you need to reverse everything in the batch. And it's a procedural decision, okay, well, I don't need to reverse everything. Well, what's faster? Creating a new batch that reverses everything and deleting the rows you don't want, or just creating a new batch and manually typing things. So usually the reversal option works pretty well. And I actually can delete this without saving. Since I haven't saved it yet, then technically the batch number has a new batch number has never been used. But if I were to save, then I'm good to go, and this effectively nullifies the original batch. I'm just going to delete it for now. Another scenario for reversals has to do with things such as month-end entries, where I'm going to accrue something for the end of the month, but technically I'm going to reverse it out the first day of the next period, the next month, and then do a new accrual at the end of the month. Some folks do this at the end of the fiscal year, depending on how maybe you have to account for the dollar value of unused leave or something like that. So I simply want to point out a feature that's available inside the batch. Now, you may elect not to use it for accounting reasons, but I want to point out the feature. So I'm just going to get rid of some of these rows so my batch goes back to balancing. Just give me a second here. I'm having trouble with my mouse. It's not selecting things properly. Save this. If it doesn't balance, that's okay. I'll just start a new row. So I'll just use an example of an existing row. So you'll notice in the right-hand side, there's a reverse on field. And I want to explain the behavior of that field. So the purpose is to allow you in a single batch to create both the original entry, so my example is like a month-end thing, and the reversal for a future date, all in the same batch. And the sequence goes like this. So when you do the original entry, and I'm just going to stick with this row, you just put in the reverse on field, what is the future date for the reversal? And I realize I would normally do an accrual instead of an expense, but just bear with me. So I'll go ahead and pick like October 1st. So I pick a date, and then I just continue with the batch. But nothing immediately changes in this batch when I add this reverse on date. So I'm going to go ahead and save the batch. And when I do, you'll notice that something did change. So when I save a batch where the reverse on field is in use, then the system automatically adds, right after the row, the reversal entry with the future period date. So you'll notice that the yellow highlighted row 39 now uses the date of October 1st and reverses the original entry. So all I have to do is put in the reverse on date, the system takes care of the rest. Now, as I mentioned, that's an accounting decision. Some folks don't want to have one batch that spans 2 periods, although the system will allow it. You just have to balance by period at some point in the batch, but it's functionally it's possible. Okay, so I could just continue with the entries, get everything to balance, and then just keep adding additional reverse on dates. The system will automatically add those rows. And finally, well, what if I decide I no longer want that reverse on entry? Then simply remove the reverse on date from the reverse on field, resave the batch, and now that the field is empty, there's no longer a corresponding row 39 for the reverse on information. Okay? So we talked about how to reverse an entire batch, as well as how to reverse individual rows in the batch, keeping in mind that if you are using future periods, the batch will have to balance by period. Each period is treated independently depending on what's in the batch. So that takes care of global corrections and reversals. And lastly, I want to take a look at using recurring batches. So first of all, what is a recurring batch? So recurring batch is really a template. In the journal entry batch page, in the upper left corner, you'll notice that there's a drop-down for the batch type. And I can switch over to recurring amount batch or percent batch. We'll focus on the amount batch, that's the one most commonly used. So these are templates, and they are used as a starting point to create a new regular batch without having to do all the entry. Now, I happen to like this a little bit better than copying a previous batch, especially for something like payroll, and I'd like to show you why I say that. So first of all, the grant activity you saw earlier did come from a recurring batch that I often use for a different type of demonstration in the sample database. So let's take a look at it. So some sample grant activity for reimbursement. So here's an example that's very similar to the one that you saw in the regular batch. But what's different about the recurring batch is the fact that there's no date. That date is selected differently depending on how you use the recurring batch. And I'll show you the way that I think is easiest. But I basically fill in whatever makes sense. Now, I do not have to this does not have to balance. It's just a starting point. And I don't have to have dollar amounts above zero. I can put in $0 amounts if that's what I want. I'll just illustrate that. So I'm going to make this one a 0 for the moment. All right. Now I can, as I pointed out before, I can take an existing batch and I can use the button at the top to copy batch as recurring amount batch. And then I end up in this place where everything except the date copies over, and then I can edit it accordingly. So just as a general suggestion, I view things in terms of data entry keystrokes. So if I'm saving a recurring batch that's, let's say, for payroll, because you've got an outside system for payroll, then the question becomes, is it easier to have $0 as the starting point for the new batch or to modify dollar amounts? I lean towards the 0, but some people don't. So you decide, am I going to or am I going to become 0? That's up to you. Regardless, you go ahead and set up the recurring batch. Now, you don't have a batch number because these don't exist as regular batches. So you give them a batch ID, and that will help you when you're searching for them to create a new regular batch. So I set up the recurring batch, save and close. Now, I think the best way to use a recurring batch is within a new regular batch, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to go ahead and start a new regular batch. The step will start a new regular batch, new sample batch. And you can go ahead and save it without closing. So I'm creating my blank batch. Once I'm inside the new blank batch, I go to the batch menu, and you'll see a choice called Use a Recurring Batch. Very interesting. So let's see what happens. So I'm presented with a list, a search box of all the recurring batches. If you don't see your list, that's related to this options button. Just click Find Now, and you'll see the list. So lo and behold, there's my grant batch that I just showed you a moment ago in recurring batches. But watch what happens next. I'm going to go ahead and select my grant recurring batch, click Open, and I am presented with a dialog box where I get to choose the post date. Now, why do I consider that to be extremely significant? Well, first of all, I'm going to go back to my slide here. First of all, I don't have to do a global change if I copy the batch. If I copy the previous payroll batch to a new regular batch, then I'm probably going to have to do a global change to fix the date because the copy feature always copies the previous date. Well, that's a time saver as far as I'm concerned. And to me, that's like the hugest thing. So even if you open a recurring batch, there's an option to copy it as a regular batch, and then it ends up inserting today's date automatically and doesn't give you this prompt. So the best thing is to start a new regular batch, go ahead and save it blank, open it up, and then from the batch menu, use a recurring batch. You'll get to choose the date, whatever date you want other than today, and voila, everything comes in. Notice my salaries came in at 0, and then I can go ahead and put in whatever number makes sense. All right? So again, I recommend that you create and store the recurring batch in that section, start a new batch, and then go ahead and use the recurring batch from within. So that's how recurring batches work. That pretty much covers our topics for today, working with journal batches and some of those fun features that are available to you within the batch and then also for the batches as a whole. So we're going to go ahead and just allow a little bit more time. If you do have any questions, you're welcome to put them into the chat window, which should be a button, I believe, at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we'll go ahead and answer them if you have any questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending today's Zobrio University session.
Thank you everyone for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be made available shortly.